Hello and welcome to Career Center. I'm Kimberly White, Executive Director of the Career and Networking Center, a resource center located in Naperville focused on providing career advice and professional development support to millennials, more seasoned workers like me, and everyone in between. Joining me today is Legacy Blueprint founder Tish Thompson to share valuable career advice, leadership tips, and everything in between. Tish, welcome.
Thank you.
So nice to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So I know I have the privilege of knowing a little bit about you, but please share a little bit about yourself with our viewing audience.
Thanks for asking. So I am, like you said in your introduction, I am the founder of a consulting practice called Legacy Blueprint. That was birthed 5 years ago out of a need to really be in control of my own craft and do my craft on my own terms. And so the focus is a consulting practice where, it's called organizational development, but when you say that, not a lot of people knows what that means. Yeah. And so I like to say we're physicians for organizations. So we go in, we diagnose what's ailing an organization, and we work with them to identify solutions to fix it. And that could come in a myriad of different ways. So we do it through executive coaching, strategic planning, do a lot of leadership development. We do a lot in the employee engagement space, do a lot of keynote addresses. So anything that deals with shaping culture through people, that's what I do.
Let's touch on each one of those.
Yes.
So executive coaching,
Yes.
tell me a little bit more about that. How do you kind of dive deep with an organization around that?
So what happens is organizations typically approach me because they want to provide a coach to, whether it's an executive or a manager level position, for a myriad of different reasons. One being it's disciplinary, which those are the tough ones.
Yeah,
or they just really see potential in someone and they really want to continue to grow them and develop them for their next role. And so I enjoy coaching. And my philosophy is, I do like inside out coaching. So we can certainly coach around functional. We can talk about leadership. We can talk about all those things. But if we haven't dealt with the inside first, then the work that we do talking about their function, leadership, is only superficial. Yeah. And so I take an inside out approach to coaching. But it's very rewarding, to see the light bulb go off for people, to have epiphanies about themselves.
Yeah. Now, when you do this executive coaching, are there times, I'm assuming there's times where the person perhaps has not had any coaching before?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so have you had instances where folks are not really on board with this coaching?
So that's a great question, because my philosophy is I can't want this more than you want it. And so before I will agree to work with someone, I'll have a one-on-one conversation with them for them to get to know me a little bit, and for me to get to know them and understand what they're looking for out of a coaching experience. And then from there, we'll decide together if this will be a match, because I don't believe that you can just fit anyone with anyone. It has to be a connection. It has to be a fit. And so I'll spend time first making sure that it's a fit before I commit to doing that engagement. And if the person is saying, I don't know why they want me to do this, then it's probably not good. Probably not a fit.
Yeah. Okay, so that's executive coaching. Then you said strategic planning.
Yep,
Let's talk
strategic
about that.
planning. So a lot of organizations, believe it or not, go about their day, they get busy, but don't really have kind of that, forecasting or where they're going. And strategic plans used to be 5 years. Now you have the strategic plan for 1 and 3 years, because it just times move so quickly. And so I work with organizations to build their strategic plan. So we'll map out, what is it that you're hoping to achieve in the next 1, 3, 5 years. And then we will work to put together a retreat in order to help build that strategic plan. And because it's one thing to have a strategic plan, it's quite another thing to execute on it. So I also provide support in the execution of the strategic plan. Yeah.
And so you mentioned earlier 10-year, it could be up to 10 years, but you really, nowadays, it's really
very narrow. Yeah, I just did a strategic planning session with the healthcare system a few weeks ago, and we focused on 5, but up to 5, but we broke it down in 1, 3, and 5 in terms of what the priorities are, because things shift and shape and move so quick, especially in healthcare. It moves a lot.
I would imagine. All right, employee engagement, I think, is another one.
Yes.
Let's talk about that one.
So that holds a sweet spot for me.
Okay.
That's a space where, people come to work and they want to generally do a great job. People don't wake up and say, gosh, I think I'm going to suck today. That's just not, that's not how people are wired. And so my role in really helping cultivate a culture of engagement is to work with organizations to create a space where people want to come to work every day. And so we do diagnosing of the environment to see, well, what's getting in the way of this person really flowing in their gifts? What's getting in the way of this person really feeling inspired to do great work? And what role does the organization play in that? What role does the leader play in that? And what role does the employee play in that? So it is a trifecta, if you will. And I think a lot of times we go at engagement the wrong way. We always put the full responsibility on that leader when they're just a part of the puzzle. It takes the whole village, if you will, to really create an environment where people want to show up every day and do their very best. So I do a lot with identifying what tool to use to assess engagement, how to roll out those engagement results, how to engage teams in the action planning process, how do you follow up with that, and how do you sustain the gain? Because we can spend a lot of time talking about engagement, and sometimes it feels like there's this big splash right around employee engagement time, and then a month or so later, employees hear nothing about it until a month before the next survey. And so it's really about how do we make this a part of who we are and what we do on an everyday basis. So
very important to do that.
Absolutely.
Too, for sure.
Absolutely.
So one that I actually had I think is when I first met you, is you were doing one around staff and leadership and crucial conversations.
Yes.
And that's a tough one. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So I would say that's probably when I think about executive coaching and I think about spending time in the leadership development space, that's probably the number one need is how do people effectively have tough conversations and do two things. One would be get the results that you want and maintain or rebuild relationships. And so it's a 2-day program, and I take people through the methodology on how to have a crucial conversation in a way that gets them the results. And it takes the stigma out of it too. Vital Smarts is the producer of that content, and they've done an amazing job creating a system, if you will, or a framework that's easy for people to use. It's not intimidating. So that, I would say, is the number one area where leaders have the most difficult time is having tough conversations.
So share just, there's an example of having to tell someone that they are not pulling their fair share, in the workplace. How does one approach that? I mean, they're just difficult conversations to have whenever you have to do that with someone. What's share a piece of advice you would
give for that? So it's interesting because I think there are some things that can be done before that so that you don't have to have that conversation. And I think part of it is setting clear expectations around what you're looking for in the role and making sure that that person understands that so that when you do have to go back and have a conversation because they may not be meeting the expectation, they're not surprised. The worst is we haven't set clear expectations and now we're trying to have this conversation with someone and they're looking at you like you got two heads, like, what are you talking about? This is the first I'm hearing it. Right. So as leaders, it's so important that we set that expectation first, and then that conversation becomes a little bit easier. And here's the other thing that's important. Sometimes we shy away from having that conversation because we think, oh, I don't want to make it worse, or oh, it'll get better. But I think of it like this. Giving them that feedback is a gift. And a lot of times people don't think of giving feedback, particularly if it's constructive, as a gift, but it is. And you may be the first person who has given them that gift, taken the time to care enough to give the gift. And so I always encourage leaders, have that conversation. It's really important because if you don't have that conversation, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. You can't be upset. The only person you can be upset with at that point is yourself because you haven't set that person down and said, hey, this is what I'm expecting from you, but this is what I'm getting. Let's talk about it.
And do you find, in most cases, then the person that's on the receiving end of that, they're going to receive it better if they have that Yeah.
It may sting at first, but when you talk about building relationships and fostering a culture of transparency and honesty and trust, the person will ultimately appreciate the fact that their leader sat down with them and said, hey, here's where you're doing great. Here's where we need to really focus on to improve you, to position you for success. That part might sting, but they'll appreciate it in the long run because then they know where they stand.
Right.
They'll know where they stand.
So I know we're going to talk a little bit about job seekers and advice for job seekers, but I want to also just touch base. You're currently working on your PhD.
I'm currently
in
business psychology.
Business psychology.
Yeah.
So on top of your business,
On top of my business.
You're almost done, I believe.
I have a year. I have 2 years to go.
Okay.
So I'll graduate in spring of 2021.
Okay. Very nice.
Yeah.
Of course, you got your company, and then I know you also wrote a book.
I did. So I was privileged. It was such an honor to be asked to be a contributing author in a book called Overcoming Mediocrity. And my chapter is called I Am Not My Hair. And so I really talk about my journey of getting to a point where I decide to live in my truth, which is the fact of I can't grow hair. And for so long, I would mask that truth with, different wigs and weaves, and I got so tired of being uncomfortable, trying to make other people comfortable with how I looked. And so I got up the courage after 4 or 5 years of self-talk between me and my stylist, and I finally said, I'm done. And I embraced my truth, and I shaved it off.
And what was that moment like?
Oh my gosh, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. For me, by the time I got to the point where I decided to shave it off, I had to do a lot of internal work first. So it was an internal,
kind of that inside out thing you talked about.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I had to really get right with me first. And then the shaving of the head was just kind of the evolution of that. But I remember the day that I walked into the salon and it was time to,
So you didn't do it,
I had my stylist do it. And when she said, are you ready? I'm like, I'm ready. So she took out the clippers and she started shaving, and we both were bawling in tears. It was so liberating. It was a weight had been lifted from me, and I was finally free.
Wow.
So there's nothing really to describe it. When you truly get to a place where you become a lover of you, there's nothing like it.
Wow.
Nothing
And you're,
like it.
speaking to that inside out thing that you spoke about earlier. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, we are going to come right back and talk a little bit more. Up next, Tish will share her thoughts on leadership, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. We will be back after these public service announcements.
I'll never forget the day our landlord called and said, read your lease. No pets allowed. My owner tells him my dog ate the lease, but that didn't work. And now I'm stuck in a shelter. But this pit bull is ready for a new crib. I'm loving, loyal, and play well with others. So don't be intimidated by all my muscles, because the biggest one I have is my heart. That's right, I said it.
Sure, I look cute now, but when my owner lost his job, it was rough. I was living on the street, and one night, me and this Cocker Spaniel got into it so bad, I wound up looking like an ice cream cone. I cried a little bit, but thankfully I got rescued, so I'm running, I'm jumping, all back to my old self, and I'm ready to give unconditional love, even if you put a lampshade on my head.
Welcome back to Career Center. I am Kimberly White, back with Legacy Blueprint founder Tish Thompson. Thanks for staying with me.
It's been awesome so far. Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about providing some advice to job seekers. Clearly, that's what we do at the Career Networking Center. And what advice would you share for folks who are in their chosen field, in their industry, but they've not really had the experience, you know, maybe right out of school, done some internship work, but what's some advice that you would share?
You know, it's interesting because I found myself in that exact situation. My career has evolved over time, and my background is organizational development, and I had absolutely no experience in that. So my background was I worked for post-secondary education. I was on the administrative side. Okay. I worked for a homeless shelter for pregnant women. And I was at a point where I needed to transition my career. I got my master's in organizational behavior. I'm like, I might as well be doing what I got what my master's in. And so I had to really think very carefully about how do I shape my resume and how do I present myself so that people see that I do have relevant experience. Even though I didn't have specific experience in the space of organizational development, there are skills that I gained throughout my time that I can transfer into that. And so what I would recommend, whether it is that you're evolving in your career or you're fresh out of school, you have experience that's transferable. So what you have to know how to do is learn the language of your craft. So learn the language of the career you're going into. And then you want to look back at the experience you had, whether it's previous roles, whether it's volunteer opportunities you had that you were in college and high school. Take a look at that and figure out, how do I craft my language to align with what they're looking for. So for example, in organizational development, one of the things that's really key is large group facilitation. And so it's like, what can I tap into? Or how can I phrase it in my resume that I have large group facilitation? And so I thought back to the work I did at the homeless shelter. And so there were times where I had to facilitate group sessions at the homeless shelter. Now, to me, it was large. Right? More than two people. So I just I crafted the language so that it aligns with what it is they're looking for. So that would be my advice.
I like that, crafting the language.
Yeah, you got to know the language of your craft. And when you know that and you think back to the experience you had, then you design your resume accordingly.
Yeah, that's interesting, but I love that. Craft your language. I have to remember to use that when we're meeting with our clients. All right, so what's the biggest mistake you've seen people make when they've mentally exited an organization, but they haven't quite left physically?
You know, and I think people suffer with this more often than we want to admit. I think when we feel like we've kind of come to the end of the runway of our current position, we begin to check out mentally, and we're like, I just don't even care. So we show up and we're not as productive as we used to be. We don't volunteer to be on committees like we used to be. And I think that is the biggest mistake we could ever make. So it's about shifting our mental model around how we see that current position, even if it doesn't fit well with us anymore. And so what I would encourage people to do is don't think about the current. Think about what you can continue to contribute in that role for your next. Because what happens is we begin to burn bridges. So we show up and we're just not that stellar employee that we used to be.
Someone is noticing.
Someone notices, and now you're going to be expecting a reference. That's not going to happen. And so even though mentally you have checked out of that role, you still have to be all in, and you have to find a space in yourself where you say, okay, I get that right now this opportunity doesn't fit for me, but what can I get out of this opportunity that propels me for my next?
I like that.
And I've had to do that soul searching. When I was transitioning from my position and going into starting my company, I was at that space where it's like my box got too small, and I just felt like I had to get out. But I had to keep telling myself, Tish, while you're here, you continue to do your absolute best. You continue to contribute, and you get everything out of this opportunity that you can to position you for your next. And the beautiful thing is, because I stayed committed to working in a spirit of excellence, that employer is now my client.
Oh, wow.
And so you have to be very, very thoughtful about your mental model when you're thinking about your job. And it's no longer about, I just don't want to be here. No, you have to be there for the meantime, so make the best of it.
It's something I heard Nikki Anderson say about that employer has trusted you. They hired you, they trusted you to do the job, so you need to do it from start to finish.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
absolutely. And if you feel like you can't give it your all, then you have to make a tough decision, and maybe you have to exit.
Yeah.
Because if you start to, be a cancer, if you will, in an organization, that doesn't serve you nor that organization, and it's not fair.
Right.
So if you're that unhappy, then it's time to
move
do your
on.
exit strategy.
Yeah. What about some interviewing tips? So I know you're full of great advice for job seekers. But what's one or two interview takeaways you have for our clients?
I think the interview starts before you even step in the door.
Absolutely.
The interview starts when you press send on that resume. That's when it starts. And so it's important that it's impeccable polish from your cover letter to your resume. If you're doing an online application, all of that speaks. That's presenting before you even walk in the door, so that has to be stellar. I think the other piece that's important, and I'm old school, so I'm big on attire and how you show up on an interview. I know nowadays folks will show up in jeans and whatever else, and I feel like it's important to stand out. So you have to dress.
Dress to impress.
To impress, incredibly professional. Firm handshake, that's so important. These noodle handshakes that you get.
Eye contact is important too.
Eye contact
all
is
of
really
that,
important. And I think in the interview, I think it's about showing interest in the role. If your only concern is how much am I going to get paid and what's my benefits package, that turns an employer off. If I'm an employer looking for someone to join my organization, I want to know that you're committed to my cause. I want to know that you're going to help us excel as an organization. So I want to hear questions like, how can I contribute to the success of your organization? Or how do you see my gifts contributing to the overall vision of your company? If you had to describe your ideal candidate, how would you describe your ideal candidate? So being able to ask those questions of that employer, I think is really important. And they're interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them.
And so it's important to have questions.
Absolutely. If I'm interviewing someone and they don't ask me questions, their resume goes at the bottom. Because that tells me, well, how much do you really care? And what is really your impetus for wanting this job? Because I want to know that you've done your research.
I was going to say, make sure you do your research.
Research is really important.
I understand that.
And thank you notes.
Thank you notes. That's cool. I know we're still there.
That's so important.
So is a thank you note okay via email?
Yes. I think nowadays it's okay to send a thank you note via email. I don't think we're at a point where we do text yet. I hope we don't go there. But email I think is appropriate, and there's nothing like a handwritten note that you send.
To even follow up after that.
To follow up.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about advice for employers. So I know once you've landed, now you're on board. And sometimes employers kind of fall short in that onboarding part, and then how do we go about keeping these folks on board, with the organization?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that employers really need to be very thoughtful about. Just as the interview starts for candidates before they even walk in the door, onboarding starts as you're courting that candidate. It's all about the experience that they have from before day one all the way through. And so I think it's important for employers to anticipate who's coming in the door. I can't tell you how many times I've heard employees say, well, they didn't even know I was coming. It was my first day and no one even knew I was coming.
Oh, wow.
And so I really encourage employers to have an onboarding schedule that's for at least the first 90 days. So what's going to happen day one? Schedule all the important meetings of key people that they need to meet with, have that set up. Make sure you have a buddy that person can go to lunch with to make sure that they have a connection to the organization. Meet with that person at day 30, day 60, and day 90 as a kind of a retention tool to say, are we who we said we are? Are there things that would keep you from staying with our organization? What's been great about your experience with us thus far? I think having those kinds of conversations is important, because statistics tells us that the highest turnover happens in the first, you see first year turnover is high turnover, but it's those first 90 days that people are really deciding if this is a fit for me or not. So in the first 90 days, they're deciding.
Yeah.
It just may take a year for them to actually leave, but in those first 90 days, they're
made their
deciding.
decision.
So an onboarding plan for the first 90 days, I think, is critical.
And then kind of an extension of that recognition piece and rewarding piece.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, rewarding recognition is important, and I think it has to be tailored to the individual, so to speak, because you have some folks who will say, I absolutely don't want public, please don't do public. Then you have some that say, I don't want public recognition.
But I really
do.
Yeah.
And so, but when you're spending time rounding with your employees, connecting with your employees, you really get to know what inspires them. Certainly you don't want to have 50 different ways that you acknowledge people, but you get to understand what really motivates someone to continue to do their best. And the only way you can do that is if you're spending that one-on-one time with them. So I think building some type of reward and recognition infrastructure is important, even if it's not organizational wide, to have something in the department where maybe it's an employee of the month or peer-to-peer recognition that happens.
It's important to have something.
Absolutely.
Right. So I want to shift real quick before we're out of time, and I want to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship. So some advice, because you left corporate America and you are successful in your business. So talk a little bit.
Thank you for that. So I started Legacy 5 years ago, and I had no clue what was going to happen as a result. And so I think the biggest advice I would give to people is trust your dream and take a chance on it, because you don't want to live a life of regret saying, gosh, what if? Or I wish I would have. And my thought process was, I'm going to take a chance on my dream, because the worst thing that can happen is that I have to go back internal. And so knowing that, having that in my mind, I just went for it full speed. People thought I was crazy. They're like, what? You're going to quit that amazing paying job and you're high up there in the organization? I'm like, yeah.
And you just did it.
And I just did it. You just got to jump. You just got to jump. I didn't have a step in front of me. So I just had to trust that when I do take a step, that a step would come underneath me. When I take another step would come under. And that has been my story.
Wow. All right, real quick before we leave. This or that. Online shopping or shopping in a store?
Whoa. Lately, online.
Online, all right. Summer or winter?
Ooh. Summer.
Okay. Couch or recliner?
Couch.
Okay. One more. Ice cream cone or snow cone?
Ice cream cone.
Ice cream cone. Oh, I got to ask one more. Beach or fire in Colorado?
A beach.
For sure.
All day.
Okay. All right. Well,
beach.
Tish, thank you so much.
Thank
I really
you for having
am so
me.
glad that you joined me on the show today. Thanks again to Tish Thompson for joining me on this month's edition of Career Center. And to our television audience, if you're looking for career or professional development support, visit the Career Networking Center at 1815 West Dale Road, Suite 900 in Naperville, or search us on the web at careernetworkingcenter.org. Thanks so much for watching.